The wax seal cracked like bone beneath Margaret Holloway's trembling fingers. Steam curled from her forgotten teacup as she unfolded the heavy parchment, her Boston parlor suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. The letterhead bore the name of a Virginia law firm she'd never heard of, and beneath it, words that made her blood turn cold. "Dear Miss Margaret Holloway," she read aloud to the empty room, her voice barely above a whisper. "We regret to inform you of the death of your great-aunt, Cordelia Holloway, who passed peacefully at Holloway Manor on the 15th of October, 1872. Margaret's hand moved to her throat. Great-aunt Cordelia. In 32 years of life, she had never once heard that name spoken in her family's Boston home. Her father had always claimed his Virginia relatives were long dead, buried in some forgotten churchyard beneath Confederate graves. The letter continued, each word seeming to burn itself into her vision. "As per the terms of Miss Cordelia Holloway's last will and testament, you are hereby designated as the sole heir to the Holloway estate, including the manor house and all surrounding lands. This inheritance comes with certain bloodline obligations and family duties that cannot be abandoned or transferred to another party." Bloodline obligations. The phrase rolled off her tongue like poison. Margaret set the letter on her writing desk, but her hands continued to shake. The paper seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the formal legal language hiding something far more sinister. The parlor door opened behind her, and Thomas entered with his usual afternoon smile, his law books tucked under one arm. He was a good man, steady and rational, everything Margaret had sought in a husband when she'd married him 3 years prior. But his smile faltered the moment he saw her face. "Margaret, darling, what's happened? You look as though you've seen a specter." She gestured weakly toward the letter. "Thomas, have I ever mentioned a great-aunt Cordelia?" He set down his books and moved to her side, his brow furrowing with concern. "I don't believe so." "Why do you ask?" "Because apparently she's dead, and she's left me everything." Margaret's voice cracked on the last word. "An entire estate in Virginia. And Thomas, the strangest part is, I've never heard her name before. Not once. My father spoke of his family as though they'd all perished during the war." Thomas picked up the letter, his lawyer's eyes scanning the formal language with practiced efficiency. Margaret watched his expression change, subtle shifts that spoke of growing unease. "This is highly unusual," he murmured. "The language here, these bloodline obligations, I've never seen such terms in an inheritance document. And look here, at the bottom." Margaret leaned closer to read where he pointed. Below the lawyer's signature was a handwritten note in spidery script: "The house has been waiting for a Holloway woman to return. Time grows short." A chill ran down Margaret's spine that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling the windows. "Thomas, what could that possibly mean?" He set the letter down carefully, as though it might burst into flames. "I don't know. But Margaret, there's something deeply unsettling about all of this. Why would your father never mention this woman? Why would she leave everything to you, someone she presumably never met?" Margaret rose from her chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the familiar streets of Boston. The gaslight flickered on the cobblestones, and horse-drawn carriages rolled past in their predictable patterns. Everything was normal, rational, safe. But the letter on her desk seemed to cast a shadow over it all, turning the comfortable into the ominous. "Perhaps my father had good reason for his silence," she said quietly. "Perhaps some family histories are better left buried." Thomas moved behind her, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. "You don't have to go, you know. You could simply refuse the inheritance. Let some other relative claim it, or let the state handle the matter." Margaret turned in his arms, studying his kind face. "But what if there are no other relatives? What if I'm truly the last? Then that's not your fault, nor your responsibility." The rational part of her mind agreed with him completely. She had built a good life in Boston, far from whatever shadows had driven her father north. She had friends, social obligations, a husband who loved her. What possible good could come from traveling to some remote Virginia estate to claim property from a woman who had been a stranger? But even as these thoughts formed, Margaret felt something stirring deep within her chest. It was more than curiosity, stronger than mere obligation. It felt like recognition, as though some buried part of herself was responding to a call she'd never consciously heard. The letter mentions a Mr. Ezra Blackwood as the estate caretaker, she said, returning to the desk. It says he's been maintaining the property and will assist with the transfer of ownership. Thomas followed her, his expression growing more troubled. Margaret, I don't like this. There's something about the entire situation that feels wrong. Why the secrecy? Why the unusual language? Why now? She picked up the letter again, noting details she'd missed in her initial shock. The paper was expensive, but old-fashioned, as though it had been written with materials from another era. The ink had a strange quality, sometimes appearing black, sometimes deep red depending on how the light struck it. Thomas, she said slowly, look at the date on this letter. He leaned over her shoulder. October 20th, 1872. What about it? That's 5 days ago. But the postmark shows it was mailed yesterday from Boston. They stared at each other in silence. The implications were impossible, yet the evidence lay before them in black and red ink. How could a letter written in Virginia 5 days ago be mailed from Boston yesterday? Margaret whispered. Thomas took the envelope, examining it closely under the lamplight. His face had gone pale. This is impossible. Unless. Unless what? Unless someone brought it to Boston personally. Someone who wanted to ensure it reached you, but didn't want to be seen delivering it. Margaret felt the walls of her comfortable world beginning to crack. The letter had not simply arrived through normal postal channels. Someone had made a journey from Virginia to Boston for the sole purpose of placing this inheritance notice in her hands. Someone who knew where she lived, who she was, and why she needed to return to a place she'd never been. Thomas, what if my father's silence wasn't about shame or loss? The words tumbled out before she could stop them. What if it was about protection? What if he brought us north to keep me away from something? Her husband's hand found hers, warm and reassuring, but she could feel the tremor in his fingers. Then perhaps we should respect his judgment and leave whatever it was undisturbed. But even as he spoke, Margaret knew she could not let this rest. The letter had awakened something in her blood, some ancestral pull that would not be denied. Whether her father had fled from shame, tragedy, or something far worse, the answers lay waiting in Virginia, in a house that had been anticipating her return. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rug where the letter had first fallen. Margaret gathered the scattered pages, her decision crystallizing with each word she reread. I have to go, Thomas. I have to know. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. Finally, he nodded slowly. Then we'll go together. Whatever secrets your family buried in Virginia, you won't face them alone. Margaret folded the letter carefully, but she could feel its presence like a weight in her hands. Somewhere in the Virginia hills, Holloway Manor waited in the darkness, keeping secrets that had driven her father from the South and maintained their silence for 32 years. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for the journey. Tonight, she would dream of a house she'd never seen, and a woman named Cordelia whose death had reached across the years to summon her home. Have you ever received news that made you question everything you thought you knew about your family? What would you do if strangers claimed you inherited a curse along with a fortune? The Virginia countryside rolled past their train window like a fever dream painted in autumn colors. Margaret pressed her face to the glass, watching the landscape grow wilder and more desolate with each mile south. 3 days of travel had brought them from the ordered streets of Boston to this untamed wilderness, where mountains loomed like sleeping giants against an overcast sky. Thomas sat beside her, his usual composure strained by the journey and the growing strangeness of their destination. They had received no response to their telegram announcing their arrival, though the station master in Richmond had assured them that messages to Holloway Manor always reached their intended recipient. Always? Margaret had asked. How often do people send messages there? The station master had given her a peculiar look. Not often, miss. But when they do, old Ezra sees that they're delivered proper. He's been looking after that place longer than anyone can remember. Now, as their hired carriage wound through increasingly narrow mountain roads, Margaret wondered what they would find at journey's end. The driver, a weathered man named Porter, had grown increasingly quiet as they climbed higher into the hills. When Thomas had attempted conversation about the local area, Porter had merely grunted and urged his horses faster. There it is, Porter said suddenly, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. Holloway Manor. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Through a break in the forest canopy, she glimpsed their destination for the first time. The manor house sprawled across a hilltop like some great sleeping beast, its Gothic architecture dark against the storm-heavy sky. Dozens of windows reflected the gray afternoon light, but there was something wrong with those reflections. They seemed to show not the surrounding landscape, but only darkness, as though the house looked inward upon itself. My God, Thomas whispered. It's enormous. The building rose 3 stories from its stone foundation, with towers and gables that seemed to twist toward the sky. Chimneys climbed like black fingers from a roof that might once have been slate but now appeared the color of old blood. Gardens that had once been formal and grand now grew wild around the structure, creating an impression of a civilized place being slowly reclaimed by something primal. Their carriage turned through iron gates that stood open like a mouth, revealing a long drive lined with ancient oaks. The trees formed a tunnel of branches overhead, their leaves whispering secrets in a language Margaret almost felt she could understand. Driver, Thomas called, how long has the manor been empty? Empty. Porter's laugh was harsh. It ain't been empty, sir. Just waiting. Before either of them could ask what he meant, a figure emerged from the shadows near the manor's front entrance. He was an elderly black man, tall and dignified despite his advanced years, wearing clothes that belonged to another decade. He approached their carriage with measured steps, his dark eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Miss Margaret Holloway, he said as Porter brought the horses to a halt. His voice was deep and cultured, with the faint accent of educated Virginia. I am Ezra Blackwood. I have been expecting you. Margaret climbed from the carriage, her legs unsteady after the long journey. Up close, the manor was even more imposing, its facade broken by countless windows that seemed to watch their every movement. The front door was massive, carved from dark wood and set beneath a stone arch decorated with symbols she didn't recognize. Mr. Blackwood, she said, extending her gloved hand. Thank you for maintaining the property. I hope my telegram reached you about our arrival. Ezra took her hand, but his touch was brief, almost hesitant. No telegram necessary, miss. The house has been preparing for your return. Thomas stepped beside her, his lawyer's instincts clearly troubled by Ezra's strange manner of speaking. Mr. Blackwood, we appreciate your service, but I wonder if you could explain the current condition of the estate. The inheritance documents were somewhat vague about practical matters. Ezra's gaze shifted to Thomas, and something flickered in those dark eyes, assessment, perhaps, or warning. The estate is as Miss Cordelia left it, sir. Nothing has been disturbed. Nothing has been changed. The Holloway women have always been very specific about such things. Holloway women? Margaret asked. Was my great-aunt not the last? She was the most recent, miss. But not the last. Ezra gestured toward the manor's entrance. Shall we go inside? The house grows restless when kept waiting. Porter was already unloading their trunks, his movements hurried and anxious. When Thomas moved to pay him, the driver shook his head vigorously. Already settled, sir. Mr. Ezra sees to such things. He climbed back onto his seat, gathering the reins. I'll be going now, before full dark sets in. Margaret watched him drive away with growing unease. Mr. Blackwood, is there some reason why he seems so eager to leave? Local superstitions, miss. Mountain folk have long memories for old stories. Ezra lifted their heaviest trunk as though it weighed nothing, his aged frame belying remarkable strength. The Holloway name carries weight in these parts. The front door opened at Ezra's touch without the sound of keys or locks. The entrance hall beyond was vast and dim, lit by a chandelier that cast strange shadows on walls lined with portraits. Margaret stepped inside and immediately felt the house's presence like a physical weight. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that made her stomach turn. The portraits, Thomas said, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged space. Are these family members? The Holloway women, sir. Dating back to the first Constance, who built this house in 1692. Margaret moved closer to examine the paintings. Each depicted a woman with the same distinctive features, high cheekbones, pale skin, and piercing green eyes that seemed to follow movement through the room. But there was something disturbing about the collection. Every face bore the same expression of barely contained anguish, as though the artist had captured each woman in a moment of profound suffering. They all look so sad, Margaret murmured, stopping before a portrait labeled, Patience Holloway, 1743 to 1761. The woman in the painting couldn't have been older than 18, but her eyes held the weight of terrible knowledge. The Holloway women have carried heavy burdens, Miss, Ezra said quietly. Each in her own time, each in her own way. Thomas was examining the portrait frames, his analytical mind cataloging details. These are all remarkably well preserved. And the technique is unusual, each appears to have been painted by the same artist, despite spanning nearly 2 centuries. The same family of artists, sir. The Holloways have always been very particular about how they wish to be remembered. Margaret paused before the newest portrait, placed at the end of the gallery. The nameplate read, Cordelia Holloway, 1834 to 1872, and the resemblance to Margaret herself was unsettling. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not her present self, but some future version marked by sorrow and secrets. She looks exactly like me, Margaret whispered. The bloodline runs true, miss. It always has. A sound from deeper in the house made them all turn, a soft weeping that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Margaret felt her heart race, but before she could speak, the sound faded. What was that? Thomas demanded. Ezra's expression remained unchanged. Old houses settle strangely, sir. The timbers remember things. Margaret wanted to challenge this explanation, but something in Ezra's tone warned her not to press the matter. Instead, she followed him up a grand staircase toward the upper floors, noting how the portraits continued to line the walls, generations of Holloway women watching their ascent with those haunted green eyes. Their rooms were on the 2nd floor, connected by a sitting area that had been prepared for their arrival. Fires burned in both hearths, and fresh linens had been placed on the beds, though Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that everything in the manor was somehow too clean, too perfectly maintained for a house that had supposedly stood empty. I've prepared dinner for 7 o'clock, Ezra said, setting down their luggage. Miss Cordelia's private study is on the 3rd floor, along with the family records you'll need to review. But miss, if I may make a suggestion. Of course. Don't go exploring the house alone after dark. The Holloway women have always been very specific about that. Thomas stepped forward, his protective instincts finally overriding his politeness. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your service to the family, but these cryptic warnings are becoming tiresome. If there are specific dangers we should know about, please speak plainly." Ezra studied Thomas for a long moment, then turned back to Margaret. "Some houses are more than wood and stone, miss. Some houses remember. And this house remembers everything the Holloway women have done within its walls." With that, he departed, leaving Margaret and Thomas alone in rooms that felt simultaneously welcoming and menacing. Margaret walked to the window, gazing out at the grounds as afternoon shadows lengthened. In the distance, she could see what appeared to be a family cemetery, its ancient headstones tilted at odd angles. "Thomas," she said quietly, "what have we gotten ourselves into?" He moved behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "I don't know. But tomorrow, we're going to demand some straightforward answers. There's something deeply wrong with this place, and with that man's behavior." Margaret nodded, but part of her wondered if straightforward answers were even possible. The house around them seemed to pulse with secrets, and every portrait in the gallery below had warned her that some knowledge came with a price too terrible to pay. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, Margaret heard the weeping again. It seemed to come from within the walls themselves, the sound of a woman mourning something lost beyond recovery. And in that mournful cry, she thought she heard her own voice, calling from some unimaginable future where all hope had died. Margaret woke to grey morning light filtering through curtains that seemed heavier than they had the night before. The weeping had continued until dawn, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it seemed to whisper directly into her ear. Thomas had slept fitfully beside her, occasionally murmuring protests at dreams she couldn't see. Breakfast waited for them in a dining room dominated by another collection of Holloway portraits. Ezra served them in silence, his manner more reserved than the previous day. When Margaret asked about the family records, he simply nodded toward the ceiling. "Third floor, miss. Miss Cordelia's study. The key is on your dressing table." The key was indeed there, though Margaret was certain it hadn't been present the night before. It was made of black iron, ornately carved with symbols that matched those over the front door. Her fingers tingled as she picked it up, as though the metal held some residual warmth. "I'm coming with you," Thomas announced as they climbed to the third floor. "Whatever we're going to discover, we'll face it together." The study door stood at the end of a long hallway lined with more portraits, but these were different from the formal paintings downstairs. These appeared to be personal sketches, intimate drawings of Holloway women in moments of private anguish. Margaret tried not to look too closely as they passed, but she caught glimpses of tears, of hands raised as if to ward off some approaching horror, of faces twisted in expressions of desperate prayer. The key turned easily in the lock, and the study door opened to reveal a room that took Margaret's breath away. The space was vast, with floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with hundreds of leather-bound journals. A massive desk sat near tall windows, its surface covered with papers and artifacts that looked far older than the 19th century. But it was the walls that drew her attention. Every available surface was covered with family trees, genealogical charts that traced the Holloway bloodline back centuries. Names were written in various hands, connected by lines that seemed to pulse with significance. And beside each name, in small, precise script, were notes that made Margaret's blood chill. Elizabeth Holloway, born 1701, first symptoms age 16, died by her own hand 1719. Mercy Holloway, born 1725, killed her infant son in 1747, hanged by the authorities. Constance Holloway, born 1748, symptoms began age 16, murdered 3 local children before disappearing into the forest. Thomas moved to her side, reading over her shoulder. "Margaret, what is this? Some kind of historical record of family mental illness?" But Margaret was already moving deeper into the room, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The journals called to her from their shelves, hundreds of them, each bearing a woman's name in faded gold lettering. She selected one at random, Prudence Holloway, 1789 to 1807, and opened it to a page near the end. The handwriting was erratic, as though written by someone in the grip of intense emotion or physical distress. The hunger grows stronger each day. Last night I found myself in the kitchen, gnawing on raw meat like some wild beast. Thomas, my dear husband, tries to comfort me, but I can see the fear in his eyes. He knows, as I now know, that something ancient and terrible flows in my blood. The dreams show me what I will become, and I would rather die than let it have me completely. Margaret's hands trembled as she set the journal aside and reached for another. Temperance Holloway, 1810 to 1828. The entries were similar, descriptions of violent urges, of blackouts during which horrible things were done, of a growing awareness that something inhuman lived within the family bloodline. "Look at this," Thomas said, his voice tight with horror. He was standing before a large chart that mapped the family's descent from the original Constance Holloway in 1692. Every single generation has produced only one daughter. Every single one shows the same pattern: normal childhood, then some kind of transformation beginning at 16, followed by either suicide or violence, always ending in death before age 30. Margaret followed the bloodline forward through the centuries, her heart sinking as she realized where it led. The final entry showed her own name, connected to her parents by a line drawn in red ink. Beside it, someone had written in fresh script, Margaret Holloway, born 1840, symptoms to begin 1872. "That's this year," she whispered. "Thomas, that's this year." But Thomas was examining something else, a thick journal bound in black leather and placed prominently on the desk. The cover bore no name, only a symbol that seemed to shift and writhe under their gaze. "This one's different," he said, opening it carefully. "The writing style, the age of the paper, this is much older than the others." Margaret moved to read over his shoulder. The text was in archaic English, difficult to decipher, but gradually the words formed meaning that chilled her to the bone. "I, Constance Holloway, do set down this record in the year of our Lord 1693, that future generations might understand the bargain struck and the price yet to be paid. My daughter lay dying of the fever, and no earthly medicine could save her. In my desperation, I sought aid from the old woman who lived deep in the forest, she who knew the ways that predate Christian law." Thomas continued reading aloud, his voice growing hoarse. "The old woman spoke of an ancient presence that dwelt in these mountains before ever white man came to this land. She said it hungered for connection to our world, and would grant my daughter life and strength beyond mortal measure in exchange for a bond that would pass through the female bloodline unto all generations. I agreed, thinking only of my child's salvation, not understanding the true nature of what I invited into our blood." Margaret sank into a chair beside the desk, the enormity of what they were discovering washing over her like ice water. She made some kind of pact. A supernatural bargain to save her daughter's life. "But look here," Thomas said, turning the page. "She describes what happened after. The daughter lived, but she was changed. Possessed of unnatural strength and intelligence, but also consumed by urges that grew stronger with each passing year. By the time she reached womanhood, she had become something that was no longer entirely human." The journal went on to describe in horrific detail how each subsequent generation had inherited this curse, how the entity, whatever it was, had grown stronger with each new host, feeding on their life force and sanity until they became vessels for its hunger. "Every Holloway woman has been fighting the same battle," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "Each one has felt herself transforming into something monstrous, and each one has chosen death rather than become whatever this thing wants them to become." Thomas closed the journal, his hands shaking. "Margaret, this is madness. These are the delusions of women suffering from hereditary mental illness, nothing more. We cannot take any of this literally. But even as he spoke, Margaret felt something stirring within her chest, something that responded to the knowledge they had uncovered like recognition. The dreams she had been having for months, dreams of hunger and violence that she had dismissed as mere nightmares. The moments of inexplicable rage that had been growing stronger. The strange way she had felt drawn to this place, as though answering a call in her blood. "Thomas," she said quietly, "yesterday, when we arrived, I felt something. A sense of belonging, of homecoming. I thought it was simply the natural response to discovering my family heritage, but what if it was something else? What if whatever lives in our bloodline recognized this place as home?" She moved to another shelf and selected a journal bearing her mother's name, Lily Holloway, 1818 to 1841. The dates made her heart race. Her mother had died at 23, just a year after Margaret's birth. The final entries were recent, the ink still vivid on the page. "I can feel it awakening in me, just as the others described. The hunger, the rage, the dreams of things I dare not name. But I will not let it touch my daughter. I would rather die than see her inherit this curse. Perhaps if I am strong enough, if I end this bloodline with myself, Margaret can live free of what has consumed us all." Tears fell onto the page as Margaret read her mother's final words. "I go now to the old place in the forest, where Constance first made her bargain. If there is a way to break what she began, I will find it. If not, at least Margaret will never know the weight of this burden. Some prices are too high for love to pay. She didn't abandon us," Margaret whispered. "She didn't die in childbirth. She sacrificed herself trying to break the curse." Thomas moved behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Margaret, you cannot believe this. These are the writings of disturbed women, creating elaborate fantasies to explain their mental illness." But Margaret was remembering things now, fragments of memory she had dismissed or explained away. The nightmares that had plagued her childhood. The moments of inexplicable violence during her adolescence, carefully hidden from everyone around her. The strange dreams that had intensified in recent months, dreams of consuming flesh and blood, of running through dark forests with inhuman strength. What if it's true, Thomas? What if all of this is true, and my 16th birthday wasn't the beginning because my mother's sacrifice delayed it? What if whatever she did is wearing off, and now, at 32, I'm finally beginning the transformation that should have started years ago? Thomas turned her to face him, his eyes desperate with the need to convince her. Even if there were some grain of truth in these family stories, there has to be a rational explanation. Perhaps some hereditary condition that manifests as violent psychosis. We can consult doctors, alienists, people who understand the human mind. But Margaret was looking past him to the window, where afternoon shadows were already lengthening despite the early hour. Night came quickly in these mountains, and with darkness, she could feel something stirring in her blood that had nothing to do with rational explanations or medical science. "Read the rest of Constance's journal," she said quietly. "Find out exactly what she bargained with, and what it wants from us. Because Thomas, I can feel it waking up inside me, and I'm afraid of what I might do when it's fully awake." That night, Margaret's dreams were no longer dreams but memories. She saw through Constance Holloway's eyes as her ancestor knelt in a forest clearing, pleading with something that shifted between shadow and substance. She felt the desperate love of a mother watching her child die, the willingness to pay any price for salvation. And she felt the moment when something ancient and hungry reached into the Holloway bloodline and made it home. She woke to find her nightgown stained with blood and earth, though she had never left her bed. Thomas stirred beside her, and in the dim pre-dawn light, she could see fresh scratches across his chest, marks that matched the shape of her fingernails. "Thomas," she whispered, shaking him gently. "Thomas, wake up." His eyes opened, immediately alert despite the early hour. When he saw her face, he sat up quickly, concern replacing sleepiness. "Margaret, what's wrong? You look terrible." She gestured to her stained clothing, to the dirt under her fingernails, to the scratches on his skin. I think it's beginning. The transformation the journals described. I dreamed I was hunting in the forest, and I woke up like this. Thomas examined his chest, his face growing pale as he realized the implications. I don't remember anything. Did I try to stop you? I don't know. I don't remember anything after falling asleep. Margaret climbed from the bed, her legs unsteady. But Thomas, in the dream, I wasn't myself. I was something else, something that needed to feed, to kill. And it felt natural. It felt right. She moved to the window, gazing out at the forest that surrounded the manor. In daylight, it appeared peaceful, almost welcoming. But she could sense something watching from among the trees, something that knew her better than she knew herself. We have to leave, Thomas said, reaching for his clothes. We'll pack immediately and return to Boston. Distance yourself from this place, from these stories, and perhaps. No. The word came out sharper than Margaret had intended, carrying a force that surprised them both. Running won't change what's in my blood. And besides, I can feel it calling me deeper into the house, into the secrets we haven't yet uncovered. If I leave now, I'll never understand what's happening to me. Thomas finished dressing and moved to her side. Then we'll face it together. But Margaret, you must promise me something. If you feel yourself losing control, if you sense that this thing is taking over, you must tell me immediately. Don't try to protect me from the truth. She nodded, though part of her wondered if she would be able to recognize the moment when she stopped being Margaret Holloway and became something else entirely. They found Ezra in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the same quiet efficiency he had shown since their arrival. But this morning, his dark eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that spoke of recognition. It's beginning, isn't it? He said without preamble. You can feel it stirring. Thomas stepped protectively beside Margaret. Mr. Blackwood, I demand you explain what you know about this family's history. These journals, these stories of some supernatural curse, what is the truth? Ezra set down the bowl he had been holding, his hand steady despite his advanced age. The truth, Mr. Thomas, is that some bargains echo through generations, and some debts come due regardless of the innocence of those who must pay them. He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a leather-bound volume Margaret hadn't seen before. Unlike the journals upstairs, this one was bound with iron clasps and covered with symbols that seemed to hurt her eyes when she looked at them directly. This belonged to the old woman who helped Constance make her original pact. My great-grandmother, who knew the old ways from before the white settlers came to these mountains. She kept detailed records of what was summoned and what was promised. Margaret found herself drawn to the book despite her fear. What exactly did Constance bargain with? Ezra opened the volume carefully, revealing pages covered with diagrams and text in a language she didn't recognize. Something ancient. Something that existed in these mountains long before human civilization, that fed on life force and grew stronger through connection to living creatures. The native tribes knew of it and avoided these places. They called it the hungry dark. Thomas scoffed, though his skepticism sounded forced. Surely you don't expect us to believe in some primitive forest demon. Believe what you will, sir. But Margaret can feel it awakening in her blood. She knows the truth without needing to understand it. Margaret nodded slowly. The name resonated with something deep inside her, stirring recognition that felt older than her own memories. It's been sleeping in our bloodline for generations, growing stronger with each new host. Yes. And now it senses that the time has come for its final manifestation. It has fed on the life force and sanity of Holloway women for nearly 2 centuries, growing powerful enough to break free from the constraints of the original bargain. What does that mean? Thomas demanded. Break free how? Ezra turned the page, revealing a diagram that made Margaret's stomach clench with sudden nausea. It showed a human figure surrounded by shadows that seemed to pour from her eyes and mouth, spreading outward like infection. The entity can exist independently if it gathers enough power. It no longer needs to inhabit a human host if it can consume enough life force to sustain itself. Margaret is meant to be the final vessel, the one who will release it fully into this world. Margaret felt something stirring in response to this explanation, a presence in her mind that purred with anticipation. For a moment, she could taste copper in her mouth and feel an overwhelming urge to sink her teeth into Thomas's throat. No, she said aloud, as much to the presence in her mind as to Ezra's revelation. I won't let it use me that way. The choice may not be yours, miss. As the entity grows stronger, it will begin to assert more control over your actions, your thoughts, your very identity. Margaret pressed her hands to her temples, trying to push back against the alien presence she could feel spreading through her consciousness like ink through water. How long do I have? Ezra consulted the ancient text, his finger tracing symbols that seemed to shift and writhe on the page. The final transformation typically occurs within days of the awakening. Once it begins, each Holloway woman has faced the same choice: surrender to the entity and become its vessel, or find the strength to end her own life before the transformation completes. There has to be another option, Thomas said desperately. Some way to fight this, to break the connection. Perhaps. Ezra closed the book carefully. But it would require returning to the place where the original bargain was made, and facing the entity directly in its place of power. No Holloway woman has ever attempted such a thing. Margaret felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to leave the house, to walk into the forest and find the ritual site Ezra described. The urge was so strong that she was already moving toward the door before Thomas caught her arm. Margaret, where are you going? I have to, it wants me to. She struggled against his grip, her strength surprising them both. Let me go, Thomas. I need to go to the forest. This is exactly what Ezra warned us about, Thomas said, holding her firmly despite her struggles. The entity is trying to control you. The rational part of Margaret's mind agreed with him, but that voice was growing smaller by the hour, drowned out by something that whispered of hunger and power and the sweet taste of fear. She could smell Thomas's blood beneath his skin, could hear his heart beating like a dinner bell. Thomas, she said through gritted teeth, you need to tie me up. Now. Before I hurt you. He stared at her in shock. Margaret, I can't. Do it. The words came out as a snarl, and Margaret felt her fingernails lengthening into something more like claws. I can feel myself changing. I can feel it taking over. Ezra moved quickly, producing rope from somewhere in the kitchen. Mr. Thomas, she's right. The transformation accelerates rapidly once it begins. We need to restrain her before she becomes dangerous. Thomas's hands shook as he helped bind Margaret to a heavy wooden chair. She could have broken free easily, she could feel inhuman strength flowing through her muscles, but some part of her that was still herself cooperated with the restraints. How long will this hold her? Thomas asked. Not long, Ezra admitted. As the entity grows stronger, her physical capabilities will increase exponentially. These ropes are more for her protection than ours. Margaret tested the bonds, feeling them strain against her enhanced strength. The sensation filled her with a dark satisfaction that terrified the small part of her mind that remained human. Tell me about the ritual site, she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. Tell me exactly where Constance made her bargain. Ezra hesitated. Miss, that knowledge is dangerous. The entity will use it to guide you there. It already knows where it is, Margaret replied. I can feel the location burning in my mind like a beacon. But if there's any chance of breaking this curse, I need to understand what we're facing. Ezra exchanged a meaningful look with Thomas, then nodded slowly. Very well. The site is deep in the forest, perhaps 2 miles from the house. It's a natural clearing centered around an ancient oak tree that predates human settlement in this region. The tree is hollow, and within that hollow space, Constance performed the ritual that bound her bloodline to the entity. Margaret could see the place in her mind with perfect clarity, as though she had visited it countless times. The enormous oak with its twisted branches, the circle of standing stones that surrounded it, the altar carved from black rock where sacrifices had been made for centuries before Constance ever arrived. "There's more," she said, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. The entity didn't just accept Constance's bargain. It had been waiting for someone like her, someone desperate enough to open the door between worlds. Thomas knelt beside her chair, his face filled with anguish. "Margaret, you're speaking as though you remember these things. As though you were there." "I can see through its memories," she replied, surprised by her own words. "The entity has existed for millennia, feeding on the life force of anything that enters its domain. The native tribes knew to avoid this place, but when European settlers arrived, they were easy prey." Ezra moved closer, his expression intense. "What else do you see? What does it want beyond simple sustenance?" Margaret closed her eyes, allowing the alien presence in her mind to show her visions that made her stomach turn. "Freedom. It wants to break free from the constraints of the forest, to spread across the entire continent. It's been using the Holloway bloodline as anchors, growing stronger with each generation, preparing for the moment when it can manifest independently." "And you're meant to be that final anchor," Thomas said quietly. "No." Margaret's eyes snapped open, blazing with an inner light that seemed to flicker between green and something much darker. "I'm meant to be the door. When the transformation completes, my body will become a gateway through which it can enter our world fully. Once that happens, it won't need the forest or the ritual site or any of the old constraints. It will be free to consume everything it encounters." The ropes around her arms began to smoke and fray, not from physical strain but from some emanating heat that surrounded her body. Thomas reached out to touch her face and jerked his hand back with a cry of pain. "She's burning up," he said to Ezra. "Her skin is like fire." "The final stage approaches," Ezra replied grimly. "Soon, the restraints will fail entirely, and the entity will drive her to the ritual site to complete the transformation." Margaret felt the truth of his words in her bones. The thing inside her was growing impatient, eager to claim its freedom after centuries of careful planning. But there was something else, some detail that nagged at the edges of her consciousness. "Ezra," she said urgently, "your great-grandmother who helped Constance, did she leave any record of how to reverse the ritual? Any way to break the bargain once it's been made?" The old man's face grew grim. "She wrote of such things, but the price is terrible. The original summoning created a debt that must be paid in blood and life force. To break the contract would require a sacrifice equal to what the entity has gained over the centuries." "What kind of sacrifice?" "The willing death of the final vessel, offered at the moment of transformation when the entity is most vulnerable." "But miss, such an attempt would almost certainly fail. The entity is too strong now, too deeply rooted in your bloodline." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. "There has to be another way. We could consult priests, scholars, people who understand such things." "By the time we could reach such people, it would be too late," Ezra said. "The transformation will complete within hours, not days." Margaret could feel the truth of this statement in the burning of her blood and the growing hunger that gnawed at her stomach. She was no longer entirely human, and with each passing moment, she could feel her humanity slipping away like sand through her fingers. "Then we go to the ritual site," she said, her voice carrying an authority that silenced both men. "We face this thing directly, and I make the choice my mother couldn't make. I end this bloodline curse, even if it costs me everything." The ropes around her arms finally gave way, falling to the floor in smoldering pieces. Margaret rose from the chair, her movements fluid and predatory. Thomas backed away instinctively, recognizing that his wife was becoming something no longer entirely safe to be near. "Margaret," he said carefully, "you're not thinking clearly. The entity is influencing your judgment." She turned to him, and for a moment, her expression was purely loving, purely human. "Thomas, I know exactly what I'm doing. And I know it's the only way to save not just you, but everyone this thing would consume if it breaks free." Then the moment passed, and her eyes blazed with inhuman hunger. "Now we go to the forest, before I lose the ability to choose anything at all." The forest path wound through ancient trees that seemed to close behind them as they passed, blocking any retreat back to the manor. Margaret led the way with inhuman certainty, her enhanced senses guiding them through darkness that should have been impenetrable. Behind her, Thomas and Ezra struggled to keep pace, their mortal eyes barely able to navigate the twisted landscape. "How much farther?" Thomas called, his voice tight with exhaustion and fear. Margaret paused, tilting her head as though listening to sounds only she could hear. "We're close. The entity can sense the ritual site. It's eager." Ezra caught up to them, breathing heavily despite his apparent familiarity with these woods. "Miss Margaret, once we reach the clearing, you must remember that everything the entity shows you will be designed to make you surrender. It will offer you power, freedom from human limitations, eternal life. You must resist these temptations." "And if I can't?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from multiple throats. "Then we'll all die tonight, and the entity will be free to spread across the continent like a plague." They crested a ridge, and below them stretched a natural amphitheater carved from the living rock. At its center stood the ancient oak Ezra had described, its massive trunk twisted into unnatural shapes by centuries of supernatural influence. The tree was indeed hollow, its interior glowing with a sickly phosphorescence that cast dancing shadows across the surrounding stones. "Dear God," Thomas whispered. "What is this place?" Margaret descended toward the clearing without answering, drawn by a compulsion she could no longer fight. As her feet touched the ritual ground, the tree's glow intensified, and she could hear something stirring within its hollow depths. "Welcome home, daughter of my blood." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking directly into her mind with an intimacy that made her skin crawl. Around the clearing, shadows began to take shape, the spirits of previous Holloway women, all of them twisted into grotesque forms by their final transformations. "You see," the entity continued, its presence growing stronger with each word. "Your ancestors found peace in surrendering to their true nature. Why fight what you were born to become?" Margaret forced herself to look at the spectral figures surrounding them. Each bore the face of a woman who had once been human, but their forms were nightmarish amalgamations of flesh and shadow, hunger and madness. These were not willing servants but prisoners, trapped in eternal torment by their failure to resist the entity's influence. "They're not at peace," she said aloud, her voice carrying across the clearing. "They're suffering. They've been suffering for centuries." Thomas and Ezra reached the edge of the circle, but some invisible barrier prevented them from entering the ritual space. Margaret was alone with the entity and the tortured spirits of her ancestors. "Suffering is perspective," the entity replied, and now she could see it taking shape within the hollow tree. It was nothing she could properly describe, a mass of shifting darkness shot through with veins of sickly light, writhing tentacles that might have been limbs or roots or something else entirely. "I offer transcendence beyond mortal concerns. Your ancestors' pain comes from clinging to their humanity, not from embracing their true potential." Margaret felt the thing's influence washing over her like a tide of honey and poison. It would be so easy to surrender, to let go of the fear and responsibility and embrace the power it offered. She could feel her body changing, becoming stronger, more perfect, freed from the limitations of mere flesh. Look what you could become, the entity whispered, and the air around Margaret shimmered with visions of herself transformed. She saw herself flying through the night sky on wings of shadow, commanding armies of creatures bound to her will, feeding on the life force of entire cities. The visions were seductive, intoxicating, almost irresistible. Almost. "Show me the truth," Margaret said, fighting against the entity's mental influence. "Show me what you really are, what you really want." The seductive visions shattered, replaced by images of a world consumed by darkness. She saw the entity spreading across the continent like a cancer, draining the life from everything it touched. Forests withered, rivers ran dry, and entire populations became hollow-eyed servants shuffling through a landscape of perpetual night. "This is your true goal," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger as her understanding deepened. "Not transcendence, but consumption. You want to devour everything. And why should that concern you?" the entity replied, its tone shifting from seductive to threatening. "You will be my queen in this new world, ruling over the remnants of humanity from a throne of bone and shadow." Margaret looked again at the spirits of her ancestors, seeing them not as warnings but as allies. Each one had fought this same battle, each one had faced the same choice, and each one had found the strength to resist until the very end. They had not surrendered willingly, they had been overwhelmed by force. "You're afraid," she realized suddenly. "That's why you need the willing cooperation of a Holloway woman. You can't break free without consent. The original bargain constrains you as much as it empowers you." The entity's form writhed with sudden rage, and the temperature in the clearing dropped until Margaret could see her breath misting in the air. "I have grown beyond such limitations. I no longer need your consent to claim what is mine by right." But Margaret could hear the uncertainty beneath its bluster. The creature was indeed constrained by the terms of Constance's original pact, bound by supernatural laws that even centuries of feeding had not allowed it to completely overcome. "Then why haven't you taken me already?" she challenged. "Why the seduction, the gradual corruption, the careful manipulation? If you're truly free to act, why not simply possess me by force?" The entity's response was a wave of pure malice that drove Margaret to her knees. She felt its consciousness pressing against hers, trying to overwhelm her individual identity and subsume her will into its own. For a moment, she thought she would be lost, her sense of self dissolving into the hungry darkness. Then she heard Thomas calling her name from beyond the barrier, his voice anchoring her to her humanity. She thought of their life together in Boston, of the children they had planned to have, of all the innocent lives that would be lost if this thing achieved its freedom. "No," she said, pushing back against the entity's assault. "I am Margaret Holloway, and I choose my own fate." The effort required to maintain her identity against the entity's overwhelming presence was exhausting, but Margaret held on, drawing strength from the spirits of her ancestors who surrounded the clearing. She could feel their support, their accumulated resistance against the creature that had tormented their bloodline for generations. "Tell me how to break the original bargain," she demanded. "Tell me how to free my family from this curse." "There is no freedom," the entity snarled. "Only surrender or destruction. Choose quickly, daughter of blood, before I lose patience with your resistance." But Margaret was remembering something from the ancient texts, some detail about the nature of supernatural pacts that Ezra had mentioned. Such bargains were bound by specific terms, and those terms could be challenged if the contracted party failed to fulfill their obligations. "What exactly did you promise Constance?" she asked. "What were the specific terms of your agreement?" The entity hesitated, and in that hesitation, Margaret heard the answer. "You promised to save her daughter's life. But you've been killing Holloway women for centuries. You've broken the original contract." "I gave them power beyond mortal ken," the entity protested. "I fulfilled my bargain." "You gave them madness and death," Margaret corrected. Every Holloway woman has died young, consumed by the very power you claimed would save them. You've been in breach of contract for nearly 2 centuries. The creature's form began to writhe more violently, and the phosphorescent glow of the hollow tree flickered like a dying flame. Around the clearing, the spirits of Margaret's ancestors grew brighter, their forms becoming more solid as the entity's control over them weakened. If you've broken the original bargain, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, then the debt is void. The Holloway bloodline owes you nothing. You cannot unmake what has been written in blood and shadow, the entity roared, but its voice now carried notes of genuine fear. Margaret stood, feeling the supernatural constraints that had bound her family for generations beginning to crack and splinter. The entity's power over her was waning, its connection to her bloodline severing as the broken contract dissolved. "Watch me," she said, and reached out to touch the hollow tree where the creature made its home. The moment her hand made contact with the ancient bark, power flowed between them, not the entity's corrupt influence flowing into her, but her own human will flowing into it. The tree began to wither, its unnatural glow fading as the supernatural parasite that had sustained it for centuries found itself cut off from its source of power. "This ends now," Margaret declared, pouring all her love for Thomas, all her determination to protect future generations, all her accumulated resistance into the dying connection between herself and the entity. "The Holloway women are free. Would you sacrifice your own life to save future generations from inheriting your family's curse? Or would survival instinct make you choose to live, knowing others would suffer for it?" The entity's death scream tore through the forest like a hurricane of anguish and rage. Margaret felt the creature's essence burning away through their connection, its accumulated power of centuries dissolving into nothing. But the process was destroying her as well, her life force flowing out through the link she had forged. Around the clearing, the spirits of her ancestors began to fade, their tortured expressions transforming into looks of profound peace as the entity's hold over them finally broke. One by one, they turned to Margaret with expressions of gratitude before dissolving into points of light that rose toward the stars. "Margaret." Thomas's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she could see him pressing against the invisible barrier that separated them. "Break the connection. You're killing yourself." But Margaret couldn't break free even if she wanted to. The entity's death throes had created a feedback loop that was consuming both their essences, burning away the supernatural corruption that had poisoned the Holloway bloodline while simultaneously draining her own life force. "Let me in," Thomas shouted to Ezra. "There has to be a way to cross the barrier. The ritual space can only be entered by those bound to the entity." Ezra replied, his voice heavy with sorrow. She must face this alone. Margaret felt herself growing weaker as the last of the entity's power drained away through their connection. But there was something else flowing between them now, something she hadn't expected. As the creature died, she was absorbing not just its malevolent influence, but its memories, its knowledge, its accumulated understanding of the supernatural forces that governed the world. She saw the entity's true origins, not a demon or forest spirit, but something far older and more alien. It had come from spaces between the stars, drawn to Earth by the suffering and conflict that had marked human civilization. It had fed on pain and fear for millennia, growing stronger with each act of violence, each moment of despair. But she also saw its weaknesses, the cosmic laws that constrained such beings, the reasons why it had needed the Holloway bloodline to anchor itself to this reality. And most importantly, she understood what would happen when it finally died. "Thomas," she called, her voice growing weaker. "I need you to listen carefully. When this is over, when the entity is gone, you must return to the manor and burn it. Burn everything, the house, the journals, all traces of what happened here." "I'm not leaving you," Thomas replied, his voice breaking. "Whatever's happening, we'll face it together." Margaret smiled despite the pain that was consuming her body. "You can't follow where I'm going." "But Thomas, I need you to know, this isn't the end. Death isn't what I thought it was. Through the entity's borrowed memories, she could see the larger pattern of existence, the way consciousness flowed between different states of being. Death was simply another form of transformation, no more final than sleep or waking. The entity showed me things, she continued, her voice growing fainter. There are other worlds, other forms of existence. Death is just stepping through a door. But even as she spoke these words of comfort, Margaret felt something unexpected happening within her body. The entity's death had broken the supernatural corruption in her bloodline, but it had also awakened something else, something that had been dormant in her genetic heritage for centuries. She was pregnant. The knowledge came to her with absolute certainty, though it should have been impossible to know so soon. But the child growing within her was no ordinary baby. It carried both her human heritage and some essence of the entity's power, transformed and purified by the breaking of the original curse. Thomas, she whispered, her hand moving to her still flat stomach. I'm carrying our daughter. And she's going to be extraordinary. The barrier around the clearing finally dissolved as the entity's influence completely faded. Thomas rushed to Margaret's side, catching her as she collapsed. Her skin was pale as porcelain, her breathing shallow and labored. Don't try to speak, he said, tears streaming down his face. We'll get you back to the manor, find a doctor. No. Margaret's voice was barely audible, but her eyes were clear and focused. Listen to me. The ritual killed the entity, but it's killing me too. The child is the only reason I've lasted this long. Ezra knelt beside them, his ancient face etched with sorrow. The breaking of such a powerful curse requires a sacrifice of equal magnitude. Your life force was the price for your bloodline's freedom. Margaret nodded weakly. But the baby will survive. She carries just enough of the entity's power to protect her from the backlash, but none of its corruption. She'll be the first Holloway woman born completely free. Thomas gathered his wife closer, as though he could somehow hold her spirit in place through the force of his love. Margaret, please. There has to be another way. There isn't, she replied, but her voice carried no sadness, only a profound sense of completion. But Thomas, this isn't tragedy. This is victory. For the first time in centuries, a Holloway woman gets to choose her own fate. I choose to break the curse. I choose to save our daughter. I choose love over survival. The first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the forest canopy, painting the clearing in shades of gold and rose. As the sunlight touched Margaret's face, she felt the last of her earthly strength flowing away. Promise me, she whispered, that you'll tell our daughter about all of this someday. Not to frighten her, but so she understands what was sacrificed for her freedom. Promise me she'll know that love was stronger than the darkness. I promise, Thomas said, his voice breaking completely. I promise she'll know what you did for her. Margaret smiled one last time, her hand still resting on her stomach where their daughter grew in safety. Take care of each other, she said, and then her eyes closed for the final time. The forest fell silent except for the sound of Thomas weeping. But as Ezra helped him lift Margaret's body for the journey back to the manor, both men could feel something fundamental had changed in the mountains around them. The oppressive weight that had hung over this place for centuries was gone, replaced by a peace that spoke of ancient wrongs finally set right. In the hollow tree where the entity had made its home, green shoots began to emerge from the withered bark. Nature was already beginning to reclaim what had been corrupted, healing wounds that had festered for longer than memory. And deep within Margaret's still form, a tiny heartbeat continued its steady rhythm, carrying the promise of a future free from the sins of the past. 6 months later, Thomas Holloway stood in the entrance hall of the manor one final time, his infant daughter sleeping peacefully in his arms. The baby had her mother's green eyes and delicate features, but there was something else in her expression, a clarity and awareness that spoke of the extraordinary heritage she carried. True to his promise, Thomas had burned most of the estate after Margaret's funeral. The journals, the family records, the ancient texts that Ezra had guarded for so long, all of it had gone into the flames. But he had preserved a few items: Margaret's personal journal, some family photographs, and most importantly, her final letter. "She's beautiful," Ezra said softly, approaching to look at the child. "And completely free. I can sense no trace of the entity's influence in her bloodline." Thomas nodded, adjusting the blanket around his daughter. They had named her Hope, a decision that would have made Margaret smile. "What will you do now? With the curse broken, there's no need for you to remain here. These mountains have been my family's responsibility for generations," Ezra replied. "But you're right, that duty has ended. I think it's time for me to see something of the world beyond these hills." They walked together through the rooms that Thomas had not burned, the main living areas that held no supernatural significance, the bedrooms where he and Margaret had spent their brief time together. Again. Everything else had been consumed by fire, the ashes scattered to the wind so that no trace of the entity's influence could ever take root again. In the portrait gallery, only one painting remained. During the night after the entity's destruction, something extraordinary had happened to the collection of Holloway women. Each portrait had transformed, the expressions of anguish and madness replaced by looks of profound peace and liberation. The paintings had become memorials not to suffering, but to sacrifice and redemption. Thomas had kept only Margaret's portrait, painted during their engagement by a Boston artist who had captured not just her physical beauty but the warmth and intelligence that had drawn him to her. It showed none of the supernatural torment that had marked the other family paintings, only a young woman in love, unaware of the destiny that awaited her. "I found something else," Ezra said, producing a small wooden box from his coat. "Hidden in Miss Cordelia's room, where the fire couldn't touch it." Thomas opened the box carefully, revealing a collection of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was feminine but unfamiliar, and the paper was yellow with age. "Love letters," Ezra explained. "From Holloway women to their husbands and children, written before the entity's influence became too strong. Messages they never had the chance to send." Thomas read the top letter, written in his mother-in-law's hand and addressed to Margaret. It spoke of love and hope for the future, of dreams for a daughter who might live free from the curse that had claimed so many. At the bottom, in Lily Holloway's careful script, were the words that would become Margaret's own final message: "Some chains are worth breaking, even if we cannot live to see the freedom our children will inherit." "She knew," Thomas whispered. Margaret's mother knew that breaking the curse would require the ultimate sacrifice, and she tried to make it herself. But she failed because the entity was still too strong, too deeply rooted, Ezra said. It took another generation of growth, another accumulation of power, before the creature became vulnerable enough for Margaret to destroy it. Hope stirred in Thomas's arms, opening her green eyes to gaze around the empty manor with the calm attention of someone far older than her months. For just a moment, Thomas could swear he saw Margaret's smile reflected in their daughter's tiny features. "We should go," he said, settling the baby more securely in his arms. "The train leaves this afternoon, and I want to be back in Boston before dark." Ezra nodded, gathering the few possessions Thomas had chosen to keep. "What will you tell her when she's old enough to understand? How do you explain a heritage like this to a child?" Thomas looked once more at Margaret's portrait, memorizing every detail of the face he would never see again except in their daughter's features. "I'll tell her the truth. That her mother was the bravest person I ever knew, and that love is always stronger than darkness. That sometimes the greatest gift we can give to future generations is the willingness to sacrifice everything so they can be free." They left the manor as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountains. Behind them, the building stood empty but no longer haunted, its windows reflecting only sky and clouds instead of the terrible secrets they had once hidden. As their carriage wound down the mountain road toward the train station, Thomas opened Margaret's final journal entry, written the night before she had faced the entity in the forest clearing. My dearest Thomas, if you are reading this, then I have succeeded in breaking the curse that has claimed so many Holloway women. I carry our daughter, and I carry the hope that she will never know the weight of inherited evil. Some prices are worth paying. Some chains are worth breaking, even if we cannot live to see the freedom our children will inherit. Tell our daughter that her mother loved her enough to die for her freedom, and that this love will protect her always. The Holloway bloodline ends with me, but our family begins with her. She will build a future unmarked by the sins of the past, and in that future, love will always triumph over darkness. Thomas closed the journal and looked down at Hope, who was watching the world pass by with the bright curiosity of someone encountering it for the first time. She would grow up free from supernatural curses, free from inherited madness, free to choose her own destiny without the weight of ancestral sins. The train whistle echoed across the mountains as they reached the station, its sound carrying a note of finality that spoke of chapters ending and new stories beginning. Thomas boarded with his daughter, carrying her toward a future that Margaret had purchased with her life but would never see. As the train pulled away from the Virginia mountains, carrying them north toward home, Hope reached up with tiny fingers to touch her father's face. In that simple gesture, Thomas felt Margaret's presence like a benediction, a promise that love truly was stronger than death, and that some sacrifices echo through generations not as curses but as blessings. Behind them, the mountains settled into peaceful silence, their ancient secrets finally laid to rest. The Holloway curse was broken, its power scattered to the winds. And in a Boston nursery that had never known supernatural shadows, Hope Holloway would grow up to become exactly what her mother had died to give her, a woman free to choose her own fate. If this story stayed with you to the end, comment, some chains are worth breaking. What family patterns would you sacrifice everything to end forever?